My husband thought he took everything from me in that courtroom. $350,000. That was the price he put on our 7 years of marriage. He and his mistress laughed, thinking I was broken. They were wrong. They did not know about the secrets buried in metal and code. They did not know about my eccentric uncle, and they certainly did not know that the most terrifying silence is the calm before the storm. My name is Eliza Hayes, and I am 38 years old. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded over the thin file in my lap. The fluorescent lights in Department 12 hummed, a low, insistent buzz that seemed to vibrate behind my eyes. The air was heavy with the smell of old floor wax, stale coffee, and the faint, acidic tang of anxiety. I focused on the polished grain of the defense table, tracing the swirls with my eyes. In my chest, a cold, hard knot had been tightening for 6 months, and today, it felt like it was finally crushing my ribs. Across the room, my husband, David Hayes, watched me. He leaned back in his chair, the custom tailoring of his suit jacket pulling just slightly across his shoulders. He was the golden boy of Silicon Valley venture capital, charismatic, brilliant, and utterly ruthless. He caught my gaze and offered a small, pitying smile. It was a look of condescending victory. Beside him, his lawyer, a man whose entire face seemed to point downward, shuffled his papers, and 2 rows behind David, in the public gallery, sat Grace Sullivan, my former colleague, my protégé at Innovate Solutions, the woman I had mentored, the woman I had confided in, the woman I had treated like a younger sister. She stared at me, her expression a poorly constructed mask of sympathy. I had found the texts, I had found the hotel receipts, but that, I was learning, was the least of their betrayals. The judge cleared his throat. He was a tired man who looked like he had seen every possible variation of human misery. He read the final judgment in a monotone drone, listing the assets, the accounts, the properties. He granted David the house in Los Gatos, the glass and steel monument I had spent 2 years designing and decorating. He granted David the entirety of our joint investment portfolio, the one David had managed with such proprietary skill. He granted David everything we had built, or rather, everything I had believed we were building. And in consideration of the dissolution of this 7-year marriage, the judge droned, finally looking up over his glasses. The court orders Mr. Hayes to pay respondent Eliza Hayes a one-time equalization payment of $350,000. $350,000. A chill, sharper than the courtroom air conditioning, washed over me. It was a severance package. It was an insult. It was the cost of a luxury car, not the dissolution of a partnership that held, by my last estimate, assets well into the tens of millions. I finally understood. The realization was as sharp and clear as a shard of glass. My entire financial life had been systematically and perfectly manipulated. David, the financial steward of our family, had been insulating assets for years. He had moved money, hidden funds, and leveraged joint accounts into ventures that existed only on paper, painting me as the high-spending, emotionally erratic PR executive who simply did not understand the complexities of high-stakes investment. He had presented it all so perfectly that the court had agreed. I was the fool. The gavel struck the woodblock. The sound was flat and final. David stood. His lawyer clapped him on the shoulder. David turned, located Grace in the gallery, and gave her a subtle, triumphant nod. I stood up. My knees felt hollow, but my spine was rigid. I picked up my file and walked down the center aisle, my heels clicking on the linoleum. I did not look at him. I did not look at her. He was expecting tears. He was expecting a scene, a final, messy outburst from the emotional wife he had described. I gave him nothing. The moment I pushed through the heavy courtroom doors, the flashes began. A half-dozen photographers swarmed the steps, a chaotic burst of light, and shouted questions. "Eliza, how does it feel? Did Grace steal your husband? David, over here." I knew instantly, with the certainty of my profession that these were not real paparazzi. They were hired. A little PR touch from David, meant to capture my humiliation for the trades, to cement the narrative. I kept my face serene, impassive, and walked through the center of them as if they were mist. I saw David emerge behind me, his smile tightening at the corners. He and Grace had wanted me to crumble for the cameras. My calm was the first thing I had done in months that genuinely angered them. I did not go back to the house. The locks had already been changed. I drove a rented sedan to a small, anonymous apartment complex 20 miles away, a furnished unit I had secured with the last of my private savings. The carpet was a flat, industrial beige. The sofa smelled faintly of chemicals and someone else's life. The shock of the descent was nauseating. Just last week, I had been the PR director for Innovate Solutions, managing a 12-person team. I had lived in a 4,000-square-foot home with infinity pools. Tonight, I was unemployed, fired 2 weeks ago for performance issues, and sitting on a particle board dining chair. My phone buzzed. It was my lawyer. His voice was heavy with defeat. "Eliza, I am so sorry. It was a gross miscarriage of justice." "I know," I said. My voice sounded strange, distant. "Listen, there is one last thing. A package arrived here for you. It's from the executor of your uncle's estate, Arthur Vance." A strange, dull ache. Uncle Arthur. He had passed away 3 months ago, and I had been so consumed by the divorce that I had barely registered the funeral. Arthur was the family black sheep, an old-school investigative journalist who had flamed out, clinging to conspiracy theories about corporate malfeasance. My father had supported him, but the rest of the family called him paranoid. "Please forward it to my new address," I said, giving him the sterile unit number. The package arrived 2 days later. It was a simple 9x12 manila envelope, surprisingly heavy, forwarded from my lawyer's office. I sat on the floor of the empty living room and tore it open. It was not a letter of condolence. It was not a sentimental keepsake. Inside was a single, heavy, old-fashioned safe deposit key. It was taped to a yellowing piece of cardstock. Underneath the key, written in Arthur's spiky, urgent ink, was one sentence. "They did the same thing to your father. Don't believe the accident." I dropped the envelope. The key hit the thin carpet with a dull thud. My father. His boating accident 10 years ago. The storm that came out of nowhere. The tragedy that had shattered my world and defined my adult life. Arthur had always muttered about it at holidays, always insisted it was wrong, that the partners had cleaned up too fast. We told him he was grieving. We told him he was delusional. I stared at the key. The blood drained from my face, and the cold knot in my chest turned into something else entirely. It was not grief. It was ice. They, a plural, accident, in quotation marks. Suddenly, the $350,000, the affair, the public humiliation it all dissolved, shrinking into something small and utterly insignificant. This was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of his. The key felt cold in my palm. It was a tangible link to a past I had dismissed as fantasy. As I sat on the beige carpet of my rented cage, the present dissolved, and I let the memories flood in. I first met David Hayes 8 years ago at the Global Tech Summit in San Francisco. I was on a panel discussing crisis management in the digital age, representing Innovate Solutions. He approached me afterward, not with the slick charm I usually encountered, but with an intense, focused interest. He was devastatingly handsome. With dark hair he kept just a little too long and eyes that seemed to analyze everything they saw. He said he had been impressed by my strategic mind. He was a venture capitalist, he explained, and he believed the future was not just in code, but in the stories we build around it. He was captivated by my work at Innovate, by the bleeding-edge AI development we were shielding. He listened, truly listened, in a way no man ever had. He was perfect, thoughtful, brilliant, and seemingly drawn to my intellect above all else. Our life together became the Silicon Valley dream. We were the quintessential power couple. Our weekends were spent at exclusive dinners in Atherton, wine-tasting trips in Napa, and charity galas where our combined presence seemed to validate whatever cause was being celebrated. Our home in Los Gatos was a testament to his success and my taste, a showpiece of minimalist luxury. And David was so supportive of my career. He loved hearing about my work. "Tell me about the new project, Eliza," he would murmur over dinner, pouring me another glass of expensive Cabernet. "This new AI protocol at Innovate. How is it progressing? What are the hurdles?" I starved for a partner who respected my ambition, shared everything. I told him about our timelines, our breakthroughs, our internal challenges. I mistook his probing interest for partnership. Soon after we married, I brought Grace Sullivan onto my team. She was young, barely 25, hungry, and smart. She reminded me of myself. I took her under my wing, mentored her, promoted her. We became inseparable at the office. We had lunch together 3 times a week, sharing secrets about office politics, about our ambitions. I told her about my life, my marriage. I trusted her implicitly. When David and I hosted parties, Grace was always there, charming everyone, fitting in perfectly. My little sister. The facade was flawless. Looking back, the cracks were so subtle I had painted over them as insignificant. The emergency business trips, David would call, his voice tight with manufactured stress, claiming a crucial investor in Shanghai or Berlin needed to be calmed. A deal in Tokyo was falling apart. He would be gone for a week, sometimes 2. When he returned, he was apologetic and more affectionate than ever, bearing gifts and stories of his success. I, busy managing my own demanding career, accepted it as the cost of our ambitious lives. And beneath those cracks was the deeper, foundational wound my father's death. It happened 10 years ago, just before I met David. A freak boating accident on the bay. He was an investor himself, a sharp, competitive player in the tech world. The reports said a sudden squall capsized his boat. He was an expert sailor, but the conditions were too much. I remembered my Uncle Arthur, standing in my father's living room during the wake, his eyes wild, refusing to accept the narrative. He cornered me by the fireplace. "It is wrong, Eliza," he had whispered, grabbing my arm. "The partners. They cleaned it all up too fast. The boat was salvaged before the Coast Guard report was even filed. They were rivals, your father and those men. Do not trust them." We shushed him. We, the grieving family, dismissed him as paranoid, lost in his own failed journalistic fantasies. He had been shouting at shadows for so long, we had stopped seeing them ourselves. Now, sitting in this barren apartment, I saw the shadows. I thought about Grace's behavior in the last year, the subtle shifts I had attributed to her own ambition. She started staying late, long after I had gone home. She volunteered to take the lead on my most high-profile projects, the ones directly related to the new AI launch. "You have so much on your plate, Eliza," she would say, her eyes wide with earnestness. "Let me help you with this." Then, key documents started to go missing, a crucial pitch deck for our second-round funding presentation, an internal memo on our proprietary code. "Oh my God, Eliza," she had cried in my office, performing the perfect panic. "I must have misplaced it. I am so sorry." I had defended her, blaming the stress, blaming our workload. I realized, with a sudden sickening jolt, that she had been pumping me for information, not just about work, but about my family, about my past. The memory was sharp, crystal clear. It was about 4 months ago, just after Uncle Arthur's funeral. Grace had taken me out for drinks, insisting I needed a break from the stress of the impending divorce. She had leaned in close, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "It is so sad about your uncle. He was the investigator, right? The paranoid one." I had nodded, uncomfortable. "Did he, you know, leave anything interesting behind?" she had asked, feigning a casual curiosity. Like, any of his old research? Any crazy files on your father's accident? At the time, I had laughed it off as insensitive, morbid curiosity. Now, I understood. She was not asking out of curiosity. She was conducting reconnaissance. They needed to know if Arthur, in his paranoid pursuit of the truth, had left anything behind that could expose them. They were not just stealing my money. They were not just stealing my career. They were terrified of what my dead uncle might have known. I stared at the heavy, intricate key. They did the same thing to your father. Don't believe the accident. The words replayed, a chilling loop, cutting through the sterile silence of the apartment. Arthur's note was not a warning from the past. It was a map. The suffocating confusion I had felt in the courtroom, the humiliation, it all evaporated. It was replaced by a glacial, terrifying clarity. What, exactly, had they done, and who, precisely, was they? I looked at my bank account online. $350,000. David thought it was a parting gift, a final insult to swat me away like a fly. He was wrong. It was seed money. I could not just walk into banks, asking about a mysterious key linked to a paranoid dead journalist. David, I now realized, would have eyes everywhere. His reach in the financial world was total. I needed someone off the grid, someone who did not exist in the same polished world he occupied. I spent 2 days and $5,000 of my rapidly dwindling funds. I used old professional contacts from my crisis PR days, calling in favors to find a name, not a company. I hired a private investigator, a man named Kenzie, whose entire online footprint consisted of a single unlisted phone number and a reputation for absolute discretion. I met him in a crowded coffee shop and paid him in cash. His only instruction was to trace the key, its origin, and its owner, quietly. Waiting for Kenzie's call was its own kind of prison. The beige walls of the apartment felt like they were shrinking. I was trapped in the quiet of the present, but my mind kept replaying the noise of the past, the precise moment the first crack had appeared in the facade. It had not been a dramatic soap opera discovery. There was no lipstick on a collar, no late-night tearful confession. It had been quiet. It had been technical. It started 3 months ago. It was not infidelity, I suspected. It was financial irregularity. David had become obsessively secretive with his laptop and phone, angling the screens away from me, closing tabs when I entered his study. He explained it away as investor privilege, sensitive deals he could not discuss. But my own gut, honed by years of managing sensitive corporate data, told me it was deception. His behavior was not that of a man protecting a deal. It was that of a man hiding a second life. I was the PR director for one of the most advanced tech firms in the Valley. I had access to software that could monitor media sentiment, track digital footprints, and, if necessary, provide full remote oversight of company devices. I used a personal license, one I kept for emergencies, and installed it on his phone while he slept one night. I told myself it was to protect our joint assets. I was lying. I was looking for a breach. I found it. But it was not what I had been looking for. The breach was not just financial. It was Grace. The thread of messages between them went back over a year. I sat on our Italian leather sofa at 2 a.m, the glow of my laptop illuminating my face as I scrolled, my stomach hollowing out, a cold sickness rising in my throat. But the nausea was not from the explicit photos or the declarations of love. It was from the business of it all. A message from Grace. She is close to finalizing the AI protocol. She is presenting it to the board next week. A reply from David Perfect. The timing has to be exact. Get the final data. We move on the project as soon as it's secured. Another from Grace. Weeks later, she is starting to ask questions about the budgets. What if she finds out about us? And David's reply, the one that stopped my breathing. Let her. It is the perfect distraction. She will be so busy with the betrayal. She will never know what hit her. It was not just an affair. It was a conspiracy. The affair was a tool, a strategic diversion, a smokescreen to cover a much larger crime. They were not just sleeping together. They were using my work, my position, my trust. They were using me to steal from Innovate Solutions. I felt stupid, profoundly, blindingly stupid. I did not wait. I did not cry. I confronted him that night. He came home just before dawn, smelling of expensive whiskey and Grace's signature perfume. I was waiting for him in our glass-walled living room, the lights of the valley glittering below us like a carpet of indifferent jewels. "I know, David," I said. My voice was perfectly level, devoid of all emotion. "About Grace, and about the project." He stopped. He did not look surprised. He did not look guilty. He looked annoyed. The charming, supportive mask I had been married to for 7 years melted away, revealing the cold, reptilian core I had always refused to see. He laughed. It was a short, sharp, ugly sound. You were just too focused on your work, Eliza," he sneered, tossing his keys onto the marble console. "Too busy climbing your little ladder to see what was right in front of you. You want to fight me on this? Go ahead." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a vicious whisper. "I will make sure you get nothing. You will be ruined." He was true to his word. The very next morning, I was called into an emergency meeting with the head of HR at Innovate Solutions. The woman, someone I had personally hired 2 years prior, looked at me with cold, procedural eyes. "Eliza, we have indisputable evidence that you have been leaking proprietary information and trade secrets." I was dumbfounded. That is absurd." She slid a file across the table. It was a log of emails, sent from my home IP address, containing fragments of our AI research, schematics, launch plans, sent to an encrypted, untraceable address. It was a perfect frame-up. Grace. It had to be Grace. She had used her access, my trust, to build this digital cage around me. I was fired, effective immediately. I was escorted out by security, my personal items dumped in a cardboard box. 2 weeks later, David filed for divorce. The humiliation was total and complete. The memory left a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. I was not just the scorned wife. I was the patsy. My phone vibrated on the floor, rattling against the hardwood. An unknown number. I snatched it. "Hello." "I have information on the key," a gravelly voice said. "Kenzie." "A bank?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. "No." A pause. "It is not a bank. It is a private, high-security archival facility. Climate-controlled, EMP-shielded, the kind of place people use when they do not trust banks or governments." I stood up, my hand tightening on the phone. "The registration is 20 years old," he continued. "It is not in Arthur Vance's name. It is registered under an alias." "What alias?" "The Watchman." The address Kenzie gave me led to an industrial park on the outskirts of San Jose, a desolate landscape of tilt-up concrete warehouses and chain-link fences. The facility itself was a monolithic gray cube, completely windowless, identified only by a small, discreet plaque bearing the name Archivalis. There was no reception, only a biometric scanner and a single reinforced steel door. I used the intercom, my voice sounding small in the open air. "I am here for Unit 704, registered to The Watchman." A moment of static. Then a synthesized voice replied, "Present key and identification." I held my driver's license to a slot. A heavy thunk echoed as a cylinder emerged. I inserted Arthur's heavy, old-fashioned key and turned it. There was a pneumatic hiss, and the massive steel door slid open, revealing a long, sterile corridor lit by the same humming fluorescent lights as the courtroom. It felt like walking into a tomb. Unit 704 was at the very end. It was not a roll-up garage door, but another steel slab, this one with a heavy combination lock. The combination, Kenzie had told me, was the date Arthur's journalistic career had been destroyed by a bogus libel suit. I dialed the numbers, and the tumblers clicked into place. I pushed the door open. The smell of dust, old paper, and ozone rushed out. This was not storage. It was not money, or gold, or family heirlooms. It was a small, cramped office, the walls lined with metallic foil-like paper, a Faraday cage. My paranoid uncle had built a fortress impenetrable to any electronic signal. In the center of the room sat a massive, black server tower, humming quietly. Around it were 3 workstations, several monitors, and shelves upon shelves of neatly labeled binders and black, encrypted hard drives. It was the meticulous, obsessive lair of a man who had been hunting something for a very long time. On the main desk, perfectly centered, was a single laminated sheet of paper. A letter addressed to me. It was Arthur's Rosetta Stone. My dearest Eliza. It began, his spiky handwriting a familiar ache. If you are reading this, I am gone, and the world has finally forced your hand. I am sorry. I tried to protect you, but I failed. I know you thought I was a fanatic, a washed-up crank. I do not blame you, but I never stopped digging. Your father deserved that. The men who did this live in the digital shadows. This room is the only light. The server is Prometheus. The primary password is the name of the boat your father lost. Below are the decryption keys for the main drives. They are categorized by subject. Do not trust what you see at first. Look deeper, follow the money, and know that David is not who he appears to be. My blood ran cold. David. He had named him. I sat at the main terminal. My hands were shaking, but my mind was sharp. I typed in the name of my father's boat. The system unlocked, revealing a clean, Spartan desktop. Dozens of encrypted drive icons, each with a cryptic label, the partners, offshore, innovate, the accident. I started where Arthur told me to. I followed the money. I clicked on a drive labeled Hayes Ventures. Using Arthur's decryption key, I opened the file. It was not a venture capital portfolio. It was a charade. My husband, the brilliant Silicon Valley VC, was a fraud. Arthur had collected everything: bank statements from shell corporations, wire transfers from Cayman accounts, internal memos from companies that had folded years ago. David was not a genius investor. He was a meticulous con artist. He was running a massive, sophisticated Ponzi scheme. He used his venture capital fund as a perfect, glittering facade. He would announce a brilliant new investment in some flashy, hypothetical startup, drawing in hundreds of millions from eager, greedy investors. But the startups were ghosts, worthless shells he had created himself. He would use the money from this new round of investors to pay dividends to the old investors, creating the illusion of massive, unprecedented returns. He had been doing it for over a decade. He inflated the values of failed companies, faked acquisitions, and buried the losses in a labyrinth of offshore accounts so complex it made me dizzy. He was a predator, and our entire life, our beautiful home, our vacations, our status, had been funded by stolen money. I felt a sudden, sharp wave of nausea. He had systematically drained our joint accounts for this. He had accused me of being financially irresponsible while he was leveraging our shared assets to prop up his house of cards. I worked for hours, the hum of the server the only sound. I uncovered the mechanism of my own ruin. The $350,000 he had paid me was not even his money. It was stolen from his latest round of victims. Then I saw it. A single file buried deep within the Hayes Ventures drive. It was labeled the Asset E. It was protected by a second, different password. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. A cold dread crept up my spine. I tried his birthday. Access denied. I tried our anniversary. Access denied. I looked back at Arthur's note. Your father deserved that. I thought of the date that had haunted me for a decade. The date of the boating accident. I typed it in. Access granted. The file opened. It was not a document. It was a single high-definition video file, a recording, dated 8 years and 2 months ago. It was from a security camera in a high-end San Francisco bar. I saw David. He looked younger, hungrier. He was sitting across from another man, someone I did not recognize, but I heard David's voice, clear and unmistakable. "Is not just a PR executive," David was saying, leaning in. "She is the key." Her father was the one who founded Innovate Solutions. He built the original architecture, the new AI protocol they are sitting on. It is his legacy, and she is the one protecting it. She has total access. The other man sipped his drink. "So you get the tech. What is in it for me?" "I get the tech," David said, his voice dropping. "And I get the girl. She is smart, but she is broken, grieving for her daddy. She will be easy to control. I marry Eliza Hayes. I get inside Innovate, and we get the one thing your father and his partners could not steal 10 years ago." I stopped the video. The room was spinning. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. This was not a marriage that fell apart. This was an infiltration that had just concluded its mission. He did not marry me despite my father's death. He married me because of it. I was not his wife. I was an asset. I was the final piece of a puzzle that had begun the day my father died. I pushed back from the desk, the video file frozen on David's smug, younger face. My entire marriage, a 7-year corporate infiltration. I wasn't a wife. I was a security breach. My mind, trained in strategic analysis, began to race, connecting the data points with sickening speed. The video was the motive. The Ponzi scheme was the context. But what was the objective? I turned back to Arthur's encrypted drives. I had been following the money. Now I followed the motive. I opened the drive labeled Innovate. It was all there. Arthur, in his paranoia, had been tracking my company for years, long before I even met David. He had scraped our press releases, internal memos, and, somehow, our R&D roadmaps. The centerpiece of it all was Project Chimera, the proprietary next-generation AI I had been overseeing. It was my father's unfinished legacy, a revolutionary piece of code that was, by all estimates, 5 years ahead of anything else on the market. Innovate Solutions was David's primary target. The pieces slammed together. His Ponzi scheme was brilliant, but it had a fatal flaw: it produced nothing. He had no real assets, just a rotating door of stolen cash. To keep attracting billion-dollar investors, he needed to show them he had his hands on the next big thing. He could not just promise returns. He had to show them the future. He needed Project Chimera. He needed to be able to lie to his investors, to tell them that his fund, Hayes Ventures, had been an early, silent seed investor in the technology. He needed my inside knowledge, my timelines, my data, my team's breakthroughs to make his lies plausible, to build a convincing mirthage. He had married me to get it. He had encouraged me to talk about my work, draining me of proprietary information over pillow talk and expensive dinners, but he could not do it alone. He needed someone on the inside, someone with hands-on access. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I left the Innovate drive and dived into offshore. I ran a search, not for David, but for Grace. The name hit instantly. A shell corporation registered in Panama. GS Holdings. The sole director, Grace Sullivan. I cross-referenced the dates. The corporation was formed over 18 months ago. Then I found the payments. A series of large, clean wire transfers from one of David's Cayman accounts directly to GS Holdings. The first transfer was for $100,000. The date was a full 6 months before I had discovered their text messages. It was not an affair. It was a business transaction. He had recruited her. I leaned back, the cold logic of their plan unfolding in my mind. It was a perfectly executed public relations campaign, a strategic diversion, and I had been its only target. They wanted me to find out about the affair. That realization hit me like a physical blow. The texts I found, the perfume on his collar, the late-night meetings, it was all calculated. It was a script. They had left a trail of breadcrumbs for me to find. knowing exactly how I would react. They needed me to be the scorned wife. They needed me to focus on the personal, emotional, devastating betrayal. While I was blinded by tears, rage, and the humiliation of a public affair, they were executing the real plan. While I was consulting divorce lawyers, they were draining Innovate's servers. They needed to neutralize me. They could not just let me walk away in a divorce. I knew too much about the project. I was too respected at the company. I would have remained a threat. So they created a new narrative. I saw the sequence with horrifying clarity. 1. David and Grace execute the affair, ensuring I discover it. 2. I, the betrayed wife, become emotional and erratic, a narrative David was already seeding with our friends and, clearly, the court. 3. While I am distracted by the implosion of my marriage, Grace uses her access, my access, to steal the final components of the Project Chimera data. 4. Grace frames me for the leak. 5. I am fired in disgrace. My credibility shattered. 6. David files for divorce, painting me as an unstable, vindictive spouse, and pays me a nuisance fee of $350,000 to make me go away. The result, David gets the proprietary tech. Grace gets a fat payday and my job, and I am left with nothing, discredited, unemployed, and too emotionally broken to ever be believed. Grace was not his mistress. She was his partner. She was the inside man, and I was the mark. I sat in the cold, shielded room, the weight of their perfect, vicious conspiracy crushing me. This was so much bigger than an affair, bigger than a Ponzi scheme. But Arthur's note had said, "They did the same thing to your father." This plan was too polished, too practiced. Had David done this before I went back to the root directory? There was one drive I had been afraid to open. The accident. My hand trembled as I decrypted it. It was not full of documents, but mostly audio files. Old, digitized cassette tapes from Arthur's days as an investigator. They were interviews, field notes, muttered observations. Most were static-filled and useless. Then I saw the last file. It was not a digitized tape. It was a clean digital audio file. The file name was just a date. 10 years ago. The week before my father died. I double-clicked. There was a hum of a restaurant in the background. Then voices. One was David's, unmistakably. Younger, but just as confident. The other voice was older, rougher, with an authority that chilled me. "He is getting too close," the older man said. "This little fund of yours is drawing the wrong kind of attention, and my father's name is sniffing around. He is too smart. He sees the pattern in the shell companies." "I can handle him," David replied. "I can buy him out." A harsh laugh from the older man. "You cannot buy him. He is one of the last honest men, and you are running a Ponzi scheme. Son, you do not handle a man like that. You solve him." There was a long silence. I could hear David take a breath. "What? What kind of solution?" David asked, his voice losing some of its bravado. "The permanent kind," the older man said, his voice flat. "He loves that boat of his. He goes out alone all the time. It would be a tragedy, a terrible accident. But you have to decide if you are in this, David, or if you are just a child playing with Daddy's money." Another pause. I held my breath, my heart seizing in my chest. "Do it," David said. The audio file ended. The audio file clicked off. The slight background hiss of the restaurant recording vanished, leaving the heavy, humming silence of the Faraday cage. Do it. David's voice. The man I had married. The man who had held me while I wept for my father. He had given the order. He had authorized the solution. My father's death was not an accident. It was an execution. I stared at the monitor, seeing not the file directory, but the images my mind supplied: a sabotaged engine, a failed radio, my father alone on the bay as the water rose around him, the older man on the recording. David's senior partner had laid it out. They had planned it. They had waited for him to be alone. They had made sure no one would be near to help. My father had gotten too close. He had been a brilliant investor, an honest man, and he had seen the rot at the core of David's fledgling empire. He had found the original Ponzi scheme and, unlike everyone else, he was not greedy enough to be bought off and not intimidated enough to be warned off. So they solved him. And my Uncle Arthur, my poor, paranoid Uncle Arthur, he had been right all along. He had stood in our living room, his eyes frantic, insisting the timeline was wrong, that the partners had cleaned up the wreckage too fast. We had treated him like a lunatic. We had shushed him, embarrassed by his refusal to accept the tragedy. He had spent the last 10 years of his life vindicating his suspicion. This room, this server, this entire obsessive archive, it was not the work of a failed journalist. It was the work of a brother hunting his brother's killer. He had followed David, tracked his every move, collected every string, knowing it all led back to this one, singular, monstrous act. He had just never found this final, specific proof. Until now. Then the true, complete, and unbearable weight of the realization landed on me. My 7-year marriage, my entire adult life. David had not just met me by chance. He had not fallen in love with me at a tech conference. He had targeted me. He had sought out the grieving daughter of the man he had just had murdered. The video file from the bar, the one that used my father's death date as a password, flashed in my mind. She is smart, but she is broken, grieving for her daddy. She will be easy to control. He had used my grief as his key, the grief he had personally manufactured. He had held me through my nightmares, listened to my stories about my father, accepted my family's love, all while knowing he was the one who had taken him from me. He had built our entire life on my father's grave, the affair, the theft from my company, the Ponzi scheme, the $350,000, all of it paled, shrinking into the insignificant crimes of a petty con man. This was the work of a monster. The icy calm I had maintained since the courtroom, the composure that had infuriated David, the emotional detachment I had used as a shield, it did not just crack, it shattered. A violent, guttural wave of nausea rose from my stomach. I stumbled back from the chair, falling against the metal-lined wall, and slid to the concrete floor. I vomited. I emptied myself onto the cold, dusty ground of my uncle's sanctuary, a wretched, acidic purge of 7 years of lies. My body convulsed, retching again and again, long after there was nothing left. I was not just heartbroken. I was poisoned. I knelt there in the corner, gasping, shaking, the smell of my own sickness filling the small room. The grief was total. It was a black, suffocating void. The man I had loved was not real. The life I had built was a meticulous, brutal invasion. I do not know how long I stayed there, a heap on the floor. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, the blackness did not swallow me. The grief did not drown me. It began to change. The shaking stopped. The nausea receded. The tears burning in my eyes dried, leaving a cold, tight feeling in my skin. Something else rose to take the grief's place. It was a cold, pure, righteous fury. It was an anger so profound and so absolute it felt like serenity. This was not about money anymore. This was not about a career. This was not about humiliation or a broken heart. This was about murder. My purpose became crystalline. I would not just expose him. I would not just call the police, who would be mired in procedure, fighting David's army of high-priced lawyers over a 10-year-old audio recording. David was a master of systems. He would twist it, delay it, or flee. No, I would not give him that chance. I would use the very tools he and Grace had used on me, my PR skills, his own stolen money, and this, Arthur's digital arsenal. I would tear down his reputation, his finances, and his freedom, and I would do it so publicly that there would be no escape. I stood up. My legs were steady. I walked back to the chair, my spine straight. I sat down and placed my hands on the keyboard. They were perfectly still. I needed his plan. A man this meticulous, a man running a decade-long con, would have an exit strategy. Arthur would have looked for it. I scanned the root directory. There it was. A final folder. One I had overlooked, its icon updated just last week. Arthur had been hunting until the very end. The folder was labeled Exit Plan. I decrypted it. It was not a sketch, it was a finished blueprint. David and Grace. They were liquidating everything, cashing out the last of the Ponzi funds, preparing a final massive wire transfer. Arthur had captured screenshots of their booked flights, copies of their new false passports, and the details of their offshore accounts in a small island nation with no extradition treaty with the United States. They were planning to disappear. I looked at the date on the itinerary. They were leaving in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. That was the timeline. In just 6 weeks, David and Grace planned to liquidate their stolen empire, wire the final tranche of cash, and disappear onto a private jet. They would leave behind a smoking crater of financial ruin, and the murder of my father would be nothing but a cold case, a ghost in Arthur's files. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I could not go to the police. David was not just a criminal, he was a master of the system. He was insulated by a fortress of high-powered lawyers, influential friends, and a public reputation built on lies. The 10-year-old audio file was my smoking gun, but in a courtroom, David would call it a deepfake, a fabrication by a vengeful ex-wife. He would bury the case in procedural motions, suing me for libel, and by the time the court unraveled the truth, he would be gone. His exit had to be involuntary. The takedown had to be public, catastrophic, and immediate. He had to be cornered in the spotlight, with no allies to call and no time to run. I looked at the $350,000 in my account, my severance, my insult. I now saw it for what it was, a war chest. Arthur's files also detailed several small hidden accounts he had maintained under his Watchman alias, containing just over $200,000 more. He had left me the evidence, and he had left me the budget. I was not hiring lawyers. I was assembling a team. Arthur's network was my new contact list. I found a name. Resnick, in a file labeled Forensic Consulting. He was a white-hat hacker, a digital ghost who had helped Arthur navigate the dark corners of corporate data security. I met him in a noisy library, a young man who looked like he had not slept in days. I did not tell him my name. I just slid a laptop across the table, showing him a single, complex string of code from David's server. His eyes widened. "That is an elegant piece of fraud," he murmured. I paid him $100,000, half in cash, half in cryptocurrency. His job was simple. I did not just want Arthur's archive. I wanted live, persistent access to David's entire digital life. I wanted the second set of books. Next, I contacted Sarah Jenkins. Her name was in Arthur's contacts as the Bulldog. She was a respected, feared investigative journalist, one of the few left who would rather break a real story than recycle a press release. She had been Arthur's colleague decades ago, and she shared his disdain for the Valley's manufactured genius. I called her from a secure, encrypted line from within Arthur's Faraday cage. "My name is not important," I said. "What is important is that I have Arthur Vance's complete files, and I have proof that the biggest name in Silicon Valley venture capital is a complete fraud." We met in the back of a dark bar. I did not show her the murder. The case was too old, too sensational. It would muddy the waters. I gave her the clean, undeniable financial crime. I showed her the blueprint for the Ponzi scheme. A slow, predatory smile spread across her face. "I have been trying to crack this bastard for 2 years," she whispered. "I knew he was dirty." She was in. Arthur's concrete box became our operations center. It was the only place in the world I trusted. Resnick set up his rig, shielded from any outside signal, and tunneled his way into David's server through a high-speed, anonymous connection. Sarah used the room as her secure base, a place to vet the data I gave her. Within 48 hours, Resnick was in. "The man is an arrogant fool," he said, his face illuminated by 3 monitors. "He keeps the real books on the same server as the fake ones, just in a partitioned, triple-encrypted drive. He likes to admire his handiwork." Resnick confirmed everything. He had the live data on the Ponzi scheme, the offshore accounts, and, most importantly, the stolen intellectual property from Innovate Solutions. While Resnick owned the digital battlefield, Sarah began the psychological one. She could not just publish the story. David would kill it with injunctions. She had to orchestrate a panic. She began, one by one, to contact David's largest, most powerful investors, the pension funds, the billionaires, the foreign sovereign wealth funds. She sent them encrypted, anonymous tips, a single verifiable statement, a wire transfer showing their investment was being used to pay dividends to a previous victim. She did not accuse. She just sowed the seeds of doubt. My job was the narrative. I was a PR director. I knew how to build a story, and this would be my masterpiece. I created burner accounts, anonymous identities. I began to leak tips to the most influential tech blogs and financial papers, not about Eliza Hayes, not about an affair. That was the small, pathetic story he wanted. I fed them a much bigger one. A house of cards at a major VC fund is about to collapse. Sources warn of a Theranos-level deception about to break in the AI space. I was not just telling a story. I was building the stage. I was creating the context of failure, so that when the news finally broke, the world would already be expecting it. We worked for 2 weeks, a blur of encrypted messages and adrenaline. The plan was working. Resnick could see the panic on David's side. His internal communications were frantic. Sarah's investors were demanding emergency meetings. My anonymous tips were being quoted on financial news networks. Then, Resnick found the accelerant. "He is spooked," he said, pointing to a newly created calendar invite. "But he is not running. He is doubling down." "What is it?" I asked, moving to his side. "He is planning one last massive score," Resnick said. "A final round of funding to placate his current investors and give him the final liquidity he needs to disappear." Resnick pulled up a document. It was David's keynote address for the Global Tech Summit in San Francisco, the largest, most watched tech conference in the world. It was scheduled in 3 weeks. I read the title of his presentation, "The Future of Belief: Unveiling the Chimera AI Protocol." My blood turned to ice. He was not just going to claim he had invested in my father's technology. He was going to stand on the biggest stage in the industry, in front of every reporter, CEO, and investor, and he was going to present my stolen work as his own. He was using my legacy to fund his escape, built on the back of my father's murder. He had just handed me the location, the time, and the weapon. "That is it," I said, my voice quiet and steady. "That is our deadline. That is the execution." David's arrogance was his greatest vulnerability. His plan to present at the Global Tech Summit was a final, grandiose act of narcissism, but his second vulnerability was sitting right next to him, Grace Sullivan. I knew Grace. I had trained her. I knew what drove her. She was not just ambitious, she was deeply, ravenously greedy. And beneath that greed, she was terrified. She was insecure, desperate for the validation that money and power provided. She had latched on to David because he was a winner. But the moment she suspected he might betray her, she would turn. David and Grace were not partners. Not really. They were 2 scorpions in a bottle, united only by a common goal. I just needed to provide a reason for them to sting each other. "Resnick," I said, turning from the monitor in Arthur's bunker, "I need you to create a piece of fiction. A very convincing, very specific piece of fiction." Resnick cracked his knuckles. "I am better than Hollywood. I need you to get inside David's personal accounts." Not the corporate ones, his private ledgers. And I need you to plant a transaction. A fake transaction. I laid out the details. It had to be a wire transfer, dated 2 days ago, for a significant sum, $5 million. It had to look like it was coming from the GS Holdings shell account Grace's Panama Corporation, the one David had been paying her into. The destination needed to be a new, untraceable account in Switzerland, one registered only to David Hayes. It had to look, for all the world, like David was beginning to drain his partner's payoff. He was cutting her out, securing his own exit, and leaving her to hold the bag. Make it sloppy, I instructed. Not sloppy enough for a bank to flag, but just sloppy enough for a panicked amateur to find. A slightly mislabeled memo, a transfer confirmation routed to the wrong folder. He is arrogant. He would make a small mistake like that. It took Resnick less than an hour. He created the false transfer log, complete with forged bank confirmations, and buried it just deep enough in David's system that it was not obvious, but would be found by anyone looking for it. Now, I had to get Grace to look. I used a new, sterile burner phone. I sent a single, anonymous text message to Grace's personal number. He is playing you. Check your GS Holdings payout. He has a new Swiss account. He is cutting you loose. I knew Grace. She would not confront David. Not yet. Her first instinct would be self-preservation. She would panic, and she would look. We watched her digital activity light up. Resnick had already compromised her personal laptop, her phone, every device she owned. We saw her log in, her fingers flying, searching David's servers. She was exactly where I wanted her to be. We saw her find the fake transaction. And we have panic, Resnick murmured, watching her screen. Grace's search patterns became frantic. She was no longer just looking, she was downloading. She was a cornered animal, gathering every piece of leverage she could. She was copying everything. She is trying to build her own insurance policy, I said, a cold satisfaction settling over me. She thinks she can use it to threaten David, to guarantee her seat on that plane. She is also an idiot, Resnick said, typing furiously. She is in a hurry. She is not downloading this to a secure encrypted drive. She is moving it to a commercial cloud storage account, her private My Data folder, so she can access it from anywhere. You can get in, Resnick laughed. I have been in. She just created a perfect, unencrypted, public-facing mirror of David's entire secret server. It was a waterfall. Grace, in her terrified, greedy haste, handed us the entire kingdom. We now had it all, cleanly separated from David's secure network, the real second set of books for the Ponzi scheme. Every stolen file from Innovate Solutions, the complete, detailed escape plan. And now, the logs of David's private Swiss account, the very one Resnick had just created. But I needed one more thing. I needed to shatter their alliance. I needed to confirm their conspiracy, their intent, from their own mouths. Kenzie, the private investigator, had finished his work. 2 weeks ago, I had paid him another $50,000. While David and Grace were busy planning their keynote and their escape, Kenzie's team had been busy. They had planted state-of-the-art listening devices in David's home office, his car, and, most critically, in Grace's apartment. Grace was on the move. She was driving to the Los Gatos house. She was going to confront him. "Bring up the audio for the house," I ordered. The speakers in Arthur's office hissed to life. We heard a door slam. Grace's voice was shrill, unrecognizable from the smooth, confident protégé I had known. "You are robbing me, you son of a bitch." David's voice was calm, icy. "What are you talking about?" "Grace, you sound hysterical. The Swiss account, $5 million. You are draining my account. You are leaving me behind." There was a pause, a heavy sigh from David, and then he laughed. It was the same condescending, cruel laugh he had used on me in our living room. "You stupid little girl," he sneered. "Of course I am. Did you really think you were a partner? You were an employee, a tool. You got me what I needed from Innovate. You took the fall for the leak, and now your purpose is served. I have copies. David, she shrieked. I have everything, the books, the Ponzi, the escape plan. I will go to the feds. I will burn you to the ground. No, you will not, David said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. Because the moment you do, I will hand them a very different file. A file that shows every single data transfer from Innovate, every single wire transfer originated from your IP address. A file that shows you, my obsessive, scorned mistress, trying to frame your boss and sabotage my company. You would not. I already did. That has been the plan from day one. Grace, if anything went wrong, if anyone got close, the entire thing was designed to land on you. The affair, the leaked files. That was your audition to be the perfect patsy. You are not my partner. You are my scapegoat. The sound of a slap, a gasp. You will give me my money, Grace sobbed. You will get on that plane. You will sit quiet, and you will take the scraps I give you, David replied, or you will spend the next 20 years in a federal prison. Now, get out of my house. I looked at Resnick. His face was pale. I clicked save on the audio file. I had it. The confession, the conspiracy, the motive, and the final brutal truth of their partnership. I had my patsy, and, thanks to David, I had my scapegoat. The day of the Global Tech Summit arrived with a manufactured electric hum. The city was flooded with attendees, their lanyards a uniform of self-importance. The main convention center was a cathedral of glass and steel, buzzing with the sound of thousands of voices discussing billions of dollars. This was David's church, and he was about to take the pulpit. I bypassed the main registration. I walked through a side entrance, a laminated 30-year-old press pass hanging around my neck. Arthur Vance, Independent Press. The name felt heavy, a shield from a man who had died trying to do what I was about to finish. The young security guard barely glanced at it. I was invisible, just another face in the media throng. I did not go to the auditorium floor. I went up, to the nervous system, the audio-visual control room perched high in the back, a dark box overlooking the massive stage. I had spent the last week using my old PR credentials to liaise with the event staff, planting the idea that I was coordinating a surprise media element for David's speech. They had given me full access. My team was in place. Sarah Jenkins, the bulldog, was exactly where she said she would be, front row, center. She looked bored, idly tapping a pen on her notepad, the perfect picture of a jaded journalist. But I knew her bag contained a high-sensitivity recorder, and her mind held the questions that would cut David to the bone. Resnick was not in the building. He was everywhere. He was in their network, their firewall, their presentation software. He had spent the last 3 days mapping their system, creating backdoors, and running simulations. He had sent me a simple message an hour ago. I own the stage. It is yours when you want it. I scanned the VIP section, the front rows reserved for the titans of the industry, the billionaires, the rivals, the marks, and there she was. Grace. She was dressed in white, an absurd choice, like a sacrificial lamb. She looked pale, her hands twisting a program in her lap. She was trapped. She had swallowed David's threat. And now she was here, playing the part of the supportive partner, hoping to secure her meager scraps from the man who had already promised to destroy her. She was the perfect, terrified, public-facing scapegoat. The house lights dimmed. A slickly produced video thundered across the 3 massive screens. A montage of David's supposed successes, fake startups, glowing and paid-for media profiles, stock footage of rocket launches and abstract data streams. The music swelled, and the announcer's voice boomed. And now, the man mapping the future of investment, the founder of Hayes Ventures, David Hayes. The applause was deafening. He walked out from the wings, bathed in a brilliant white spotlight. He smiled, that perfect, charismatic smile that had charmed me, charmed investors, charmed the world. He raised a hand, soaking in the adoration. He looked every inch the visionary. Thank you, he began, his voice resonating with false humility. He started his speech. The future of trust in tech investing. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. He paced the stage, a master showman. He spoke of vision, of connection, of building a better world through disruptive technology. He was selling them the dream, one last time, before he ripped them all off and vanished. I stood in the deep shadow of the control booth, a ghost in the machine. A headset was clamped over one ear, connecting me to Resnick's secure line. I watched my husband, not on the stage, but on a small 10-inch preview monitor. He was a tiny, digitized figure, lying to thousands. I felt nothing, no anger, no sadness. The fire of my grief had burned away, leaving only a cold, hard purpose. This was not an act of passion. This was a demolition. David was reaching his peak. But trust is not just a feeling, he preached, his voice rising. It must be built on a foundation of proof, of results. Today, I am not just here to talk about the future. I am here to show it to you. The key to that future, the technology I have been nurturing for 3 years, is Project Chimera. He paused for effect, the crowd silent, hanging on his every word. He smiled, the spotlight glinting off his teeth. Because in our world, in the world I am building, transparency is everything. He hit the line. My thumb moved to the secure app on my phone, the one that would give Resnick the green light. In that exact half-second, the phone in my pocket vibrated. A different notification. A text message from Kenzie, who was monitoring the building exits. I glanced down. The message was short. Federal agents are in the building. Main lobby and all exits. They received an anonymous tip. He cannot escape. I read the text. The trap was not just a stage. It was now a physical cage. My anonymous tip, sent 24 hours ago to the FBI's Cybercrimes Division along with the full Ponzi data, had been acted upon. I looked up at the monitor. David was standing there, his arms wide, basking in the silence, waiting for his slide to change to the stolen Innovate data. A small, cold smile touched my lips. I brought the headset microphone closer. Now, Resnick, I whispered. Now. On the massive 60-foot screens behind David, the beautifully designed Project Chimera slide did not appear. Instead, there was a thunk as the system feed switched. The image that replaced it was stark, ugly, and undeniable. It was a complex balance sheet. David's smile froze. He half-turned, confused. Across the top, in bold letters, was the title, Hayes Ventures Internal Ledger Actual, and beside it, Investor Funds, Deficit. A sea of red arrows dominated the screen, showing lines of money flowing out. Not to startups, not to investments. They flowed directly to accounts labeled Cayman Holdings, Panama GS, and D. Hayes Private, Zurich. It was his Ponzi scheme, laid bare in real time, showing a deficit of over $900 million. A confused murmur rippled through the audience. David tapped his earpiece, his face tightening, signaling frantically to the tech booth, but his microphone was live. His sharp, panicked stage whisper echoed through the auditorium. What is this? Get this down, get it down now. The screen changed again. It was no longer a spreadsheet. It was a side-by-side comparison of emails. On the left, emails from my account, the ones Grace had faked to get me fired. On the right, emails from David's personal account to Grace Sullivan, with timestamps from the exact same minutes. David, she is taking the bait. Initiate the data transfer now. Use her IP. Grace, done. She will be locked out in an hour. David, good girl. You have earned your bonus. The murmur in the crowd turned into a low, angry roar. David was hyperventilating, his eyes wide, staring at his own betrayal broadcast to the entire industry. "Shut it off," he screamed, his voice cracking. "Shut the system down." But the system was not his anymore. It was mine. The audio. "Resnick," I whispered. "Full volume." The sound that erupted was not David's polished keynote. It was his voice, raw, ugly, and full of contempt, captured from the bug in his living room. "You stupid little girl. Of course I am. Did you really think you were a partner? You were a tool." The camera feeds in the room, now controlled by Resnick, zoomed in on Grace in the front row. 1,000 faces turned to watch her as she heard her own voice shriek, "I have copies, David, I will burn you to the ground." And David's cold, clear reply echoed, sealing her fate with his. "I already did. If anything went wrong, the entire thing was designed to land on you. You are not my partner. You are my scapegoat." The auditorium was paralyzed. Grace looked like she had turned to stone, her face a mask of abject horror. And then, I played the final file. The restaurant hiss filled the speakers, and then the voice of the older man, "You solve him." And David's voice, 10 years younger, but unmistakably his, sealing his true fate. "Do it." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum, a black hole of shared shock. Every person in that room understood. This was not just fraud. This was murder. David Hayes stood alone on the stage, white as a sheet, the sweat pouring down his face, his custom suit suddenly looking like a prisoner's uniform. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Into that perfect, terrible silence, a single voice rose from the front row. Sarah Jenkins stood up, her journalist's pen now pointed at him like a weapon. "Mr. Hayes," she called out, her voice sharp and clear. "Mr. Hayes, do you have a comment on the murder of Edward Vance?" That broke the spell. It was an explosion. Chairs scraped. People shouted. The billionaires, his investors, were on their feet, screaming for his blood, calling their security, their lawyers. It was chaos. And through the chaos, from the main doors at the back, they came. 6 men in dark blue vests, FBI printed in bold yellow letters. They moved with a calm, professional purpose, ignoring the panic, their eyes locked on the stage. They walked up the stairs. David saw them and made a single, desperate, animalistic move toward the back of the stage. But Kenzie's text was right. 2 more agents emerged from the wings, cutting off his escape. I watched on the small monitor. I watched them pull his arms behind his back, the click of the handcuffs echoing over his still live microphone. The visionary of Silicon Valley, arrested for fraud, conspiracy, and murder in front of his entire world. In the ensuing panic, I saw Grace. She had bolted from her seat, trying to blend into the stampede of people rushing for the exits. But 2 agents were waiting for her in the aisle. They stopped her, a hand on her arm. Her scapegoat plan had failed. She crumpled, her white dress pooling on the floor as they cuffed her hands. I stood in the darkness of the control booth, watching it all. I had not spent $350,000 on revenge. I had invested it. David had taken my money, my house, and my career. I had taken his freedom, his reputation, his stolen fortune, and his future. I took off Arthur's press pass, placing it gently on the console. I turned and walked out of the booth, down the service stairs, and into the afternoon sun, long before the lights came back on. Thank you for listening to my story. I invite you to comment where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to Lily Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support even more by hitting the hype button so this story in this video can be heard by more people.